So I wanted to go back to Isaiah because you mentioned something about eschatology, how if it's really speaking about the Sabbath in heaven, why does it mention the Levitical priests? But like there's a certain pattern if you read throughout the book of Isaiah, there's a certain pattern that he has, and it's real consistent throughout the book. So I want to take you to Isaiah chapter 2 real quick. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 1. So it says, the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So real quick, Isaiah, who is Isaiah? Who is Isaiah speaking to in this chapter in verse 1?
The son of Amos, the son of
Right.
Amos concerning
He,
Jesus.
he's speaking to people at that time, isn't he?
Yeah,
At that particular time, right?
sure.
Specifically those in Judah and Jerusalem. Now let's go to verse 12. Verse 12 says, for the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone that is proud and lofty, and upon everyone that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. So he's speaking to the people in Jerusalem and Judah about the day of the Lord, right? Let's go to verse 20. In that day, a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rock and the tops of the ragged rocks, for the fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted for? I want you to pay attention to something. Isaiah, he's speaking specifically to the people at this particular time, right? But then he starts to speak about the day of the Lord. And he says that, all right, on the day of the Lord, there are going to be people that will run to the clefts of the rocks and to the mountains. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like Revelation chapter 6. Let's go to Revelation chapter 6 real quick. Let's
Or
go
even
to Revelation chapter 6. Let's go to like verse 14. It says, and the heaven departed as a scroll when it's rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places, and the kings of the earth and the great men and the rich men and the chief captains and the mighty men and every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So do you see how Isaiah, he is speaking to people specifically at that time, but there's a dual application to what will go on in the last days?
Yeah. Okay.
He's kind of like, he has a way of going back and forth. He's talking to you, but then he's also talking to people later down in the future. Let's look at another example. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 7 to see if we can see this pattern again. Let's start from verse 10. It says, moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz. Who was God speaking to?
Ahaz.
Ahaz, right? He said, ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And he said, hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men? But will ye weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So notice how in Isaiah he's speaking to Ahaz, right?
Yeah.
But then there's a dual application also. He's speaking to Ahaz, but he's also speaking to a time coming years, thousands of years down the line to when the Messiah would be born.
Yeah.
So Isaiah, he has a pattern of speaking about one thing at one particular time, and in the same exact chapter, jumping back and forth between two time periods.
Yeah.
So when we read in Isaiah 66 how it mentions the priests, and then it mentions the new heavens and the new earth. Isaiah, he's simply following that same exact pattern where he's speaking about what will happen in the last days, but he's also speaking about the people at that particular time. And he's going back and forth. That's just his style of writing. That's just his pattern. So,
Can I can I add to that, and then I'm not gonna make a different point, Elijah. I'm gonna make the same point, but just add to it, and then I want to hear your thoughts on what was just said. Um, Let me share that my slide here with you. This is one of the PowerPoints I use when I do some teachings. A little bit of a visual of what Deontay's trying to break down. Um, have you ever heard people say that Isaiah is the mini gospel? Elijah, have you ever heard that before? I don't know if you have.
Not really, but I mean,
Maybe
there's
not. Maybe not. Okay, well, I have, right? I think there's some merit to it, and here's why. A lot of what we're seeing in Isaiah, we see repeated throughout the New Testament on a more grandier, more wider, a bigger scale. It's Isaiah is going to speak the way a Hebrew would speak at his time. He will say Levite priests, right? He will talk. He'll mention chariots. He'll mention these things because he's going to talk that way. But when he says Babylon in Isaiah, like Jeremiah would say Babylon in Jeremiah, is fallen, because Jeremiah, by the way, says Babylon is fallen. You read in Revelation on a more worldwide scale that Babylon is fallen, right? What we're seeing is a repeat and expand principle. A lot of scholars know about this. It's called a repeat and expand principle. Something is spoken and then repeated on with to give more details, and some often going from a local application to a wider, broader, worldwide application. Here's an example. And you can go all the way to chapter 1 to do this, but in my PowerPoint, I started in chapter 53. So in chapter 53 of Isaiah, you have the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah. You know that chapter, I'm sure, right? But you have a parallel between that and the event taking place in the New Testament. Do you see that? There's a parallel taking place, right? You have on the next point that there's a call to enlarge Israel's borders as a result of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah in chapter 54. You see that taking place in the New Testament. The Gentiles now start flocking to the gospel message. In chapter 55, you have an invitation for everyone to come. And then you have Jews and Gentiles accepting the gospel. And then you have an invitation for Gentiles to join the covenant. In the New Testament, you have, of course, the new covenant, right? Incidentally, you have the Sabbath in Isaiah 56 as you go down the list, and suddenly you see Gentiles partaking of the Sabbath as well in the New Testament. On and on and on until you get to the new heavens and new earth. It makes sense that what we're reading in Isaiah 66 on what seems to be a local scale, by saying the words new heaven and new earth, we can then connect that to the same reference in the New Testament where Peter mentions it in quite a literal way, and then John mentions it as well, and then see a parallel taking place, right? So yes, Isaiah would talk the way he does as a Hebrew, right? And he would say certain terms, but now let's see how the New Testament applies that on a more worldwide scale. So you've got the Levitical priesthood, but then you've got in Revelation saying we're going to be priests on the new earth, right? You have the new moon mentioned in Isaiah 66, but then you have Isaiah Revelation chapter 20 or it's 21, saying that on a month to month basis, we're going to be gathering a tree of life, right? You have this real consistent pattern taking place from one to the other. We can't pull from Isaiah to interpret Revelation or the New Testament. We use Revelation and the New Testament to interpret Isaiah on a more worldwide scale. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting take. I haven't heard that. So, yeah, that is very cool.